Good day to you. I chose this setting because it's a wild and woolly day here in Pennsylvania with the wind blowing around, moisture in the air, clouds and darkness all around. Still warm though, still warm. Something strange about the weather today. We don't normally get this kind of weather in Pennsylvania. We do. It's not completely uncommon. Some people would say that this is the result of climate change. Some people would say actually that it's a result of climate change that is unnecessary because it's being caused by human beings who are damaging the climate. Some people would say that most people don't have as urgent of a need to change the climate as they should. Some people would go that far. Some people would say that the media are not doing enough to let people know how truly bad of a shape the entire world is in because of the reduction of forests, the raising of temperatures, the melting of ice in the polar regions, and the really, really drastic weather changes that are going on, including weather like we might be having today. Now, I'm not offering this to try and convince you of any particular perspective. I'm starting this class with a dilemma that media has a part in. It's the dilemma of what exactly do you do when you're trying to convey information about a subject like the climate. And that fits in with what we're talking about today because we're taking on a subject today that's called pragmatism. And although you may think of it as being similar to that word practical, it's got some same properties, but it's not. It's a different word, pragmatism. And what it refers to is looking at the outcomes of events to determine the truth. Now, I know that sounds kind of fuzzy, to look at the outcomes of events to determine the truth, but that's exactly what we're doing when we're talking about climate change. Are we? Are we not? I should say when we say that the media should be providing information to the public on the rising of temperatures, the spreading of gases, or the other direction as well, the reduction of gases. I can tell you, I lived in California for good 3-4 years. I lived there twice, and last time I lived there 3 years, and it was definitely in much worse shape than it is today when it comes to smog. So I'm not talking in any particular direction here so much as I'm talking about what is the role of media, and the way that you determine that is by the outcomes. That's what we're heading into today. We're talking about pragmatic analysis. It's the next one, and once again, I encourage you to drop on by those hours. If you want to talk over some of these ideas, just bat around some ideas that you heard in today's video lecture or that you read in the chapter. That's what those hours are for, to extend your mind, to reaffirm thoughts that you may have, to continue any curiosities that you might have from taking on this material. And I also want to say that next week we will not have class. I'm taking a personal day, so we will not have class next Thursday. It's going to be your day to do whatever you want, and we will be resuming 2 weeks from today with media criticism. So let's head on into pragmatic analysis, or pragmatism as it was called when it was studied as a movement. And it really asks, what is the role of government in media? What is the role of government? Should media, for example, be state-owned? Should the state, that word is used to refer to a nation's governing body, so in our case, the Senate, the House, the presidency, the Supreme Court, so on, should media be state-owned? Should the state actually own it? Or is that subjecting media to problems of censorship? Or should media just simply be state-run? That means that media have to abide by certain rules and regulations, like not committing libel, for example, or state monitored or state regulated. Or at the other end of the spectrum, should media be independent? Should they be left to operate on their own? That's mainly, by the way, the theory about media in the United States is they for the most part, should be left to operate alone. Only the government will only step in if the media are breaking the law or playing unfairly. That's the general philosophy that the U.S. has. It actually has a pragmatic philosophy. So who is responsible for pragmatism? It comes mainly from the founder, his name is Charles Sanders Peirce. Charles Sanders Peirce, but it's associated with other people as well. It is, in fact, a branch of philosophy, pragmatism. Yeah, it's a branch of philosophy. It's an American philosophy. And it's trying to look at the truth. That's a concept, right? It's a truth is something that we all try to sort out. Like, what's really the truth behind this argument that's happening between these two people? What's really the truth behind the character on this TV show that's being portrayed as guilty, but you wonder whether they're really innocent. To what degree is the truth in any context like that? How does it provide us with a means of measuring it by the problems that are solved, the outcomes that are happening from whatever it is that we're looking at? So, in other words, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get rid of a search for underlying truths that was the case with past philosophies, to look for underlying truth. If you study really deep philosophers like Nietzsche or Hegel, those happen to be German philosophers, or David Hume, Scottish philosophers, they did say that there are underlying truths that humans just need to discover. And religion actually has a lot of that same kind of thinking as well. But that's not what we're talking about with pragmatism. We're looking at truth very, very differently. We're looking at in terms of how problems are solved and what those outcomes are. The next big pragmatist to come down the road, and we'll find this is the case for all of the perspectives that we study in this class, the next person to come along and develop that even further, and many people are developing these perspectives further as they dive into it as their academic specialty. The next person was William James. William James, I can remember reading a lot about William James in my history classes when I was an undergraduate, because he had a lot to do with reforming education here in the United States. William James was a psychologist. He's living from 1842 to 1910, and he wrote about pragmatism, and he talked specifically about a term he used called the habit. The habit. A habit, he said, was a pathway of discharge formed in the brain by which incoming events escape. Wow. It's a pathway of discharge formed in the brain by which incoming events escape. So something comes in and events escape out. So habits can be good, like when you're exercising to release stress, you're all tight and everything, so you go for a run, you're letting out that tension, right? That's what a habit is. It's taking something internal and pushing it on out. Habits can also be bad too, like eating a ton of ice cream because you're in a sad mood. That's not good, but it's another kind of habit. So it can be an either-or situation. We have only to look at what the outcome is to determine the truth and whether the habit is good. That's what William James is saying. The next person to come along, next philosopher, another American, was John Dewey. John Dewey was also writing very much about education in the United States and reforming education and making it national, which it is not. It's done by local school boards. We don't have a national education system in the U.S. And you might recognize his name, Dewey, from the Dewey Decimal System, because he is responsible for the way that library books are organized today. John Dewey is. John Dewey, living from 1859 to 1952, he was actually what's known as an educational theorist. Yeah, he was theorizing about education. And he wrote a book called Reconstruction in Philosophy. I mean, just try and digest it. It's only 3 words, but it turns your head round and round. Reconstruction in philosophy? What's that about? He's saying that the ways of thinking are habits. He's using that word too, habits, that people generate to overcome difficulties. That we all have difficulties in our life. We all have things that are hanging us up, irritations, challenges, obstacles. And so we develop habits to overcome that. And the ability to communicate with others is what keeps one's habits, he said, from calcifying. Calcifying is coming from that word calcium. It's like when our habits get encrusted and they don't change. So he's saying there needs to be change. And he's saying that we need to have more ad hoc moments in our life, moments where we're not planning things as much. So communicating is one way to do that. Communicating with others, as opposed to going into isolation and removing ourselves from others, communicating with others is what helps keep our habits from remaining stale all the time, doing the same thing every day. He has another term that he uses. It's called meliorism. Meliorism, he's responsible for that term, M-E-L-I-O-R-I-S-M, meliorism. That's the recognition of elements present in a particular historical moment and the use of applied applied techniques to improve them. So meliorism is this particular moment, and we can say the pandemic is our meliorism it's a tough word to say. The pandemic is a meliorism for our age, and we're still in it. We don't even realize how difficult it is because we're still in it. We still have restrictions on us. We still have concerns about our health. We still have people who are sickly and who are dying. So it is most definitely a particular historical moment, and it's stuff for us to examine because we're still in it. But
Ameliorism refers to recognizing that we have a moment here. We will also have a moment, I think, when we come out of it and be known as the age where we had a rebirth or a regeneration. We're kind of seeing that now at the university, in my opinion. The students, in my opinion, are the most motivated that I've seen them in years in my classes and the most eager to learn. It truly is amazing to see it and very, very uplifting. So anyway, he was arguing in education along his line of thinking that it should shift away from what he called rote memorization, and it should move more towards flexible problem solving. There's that term coming into use now in terms of pragmatic thought. Pragmatism is problem solving. You know what rote memorization is, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Do you actually lay those numbers side by side in your mind when you do it, or have you just memorized 2 plus 2 is 4? That's rote memorization, right? He's saying get away from that. Get students involved in problem solving. And you can actually see a lot of his impact in your university classes today. A lot of university, every time your classes break up and get into small groups, that's coming out of John Dewey. We can thank John Dewey for that. Let's move on to the next philosopher now, who's Richard Rorty, Rorty, 1931 to 2007. 1931 and 2007 comes right up to the modern day age almost. And that's one thing I like about this class. We're not just studying ancient critics, we're studying modern day contributors. And who knows, maybe somebody in this class is going to be a media critic in the future in this kind of vein as well. So Richard Rorty was known as what is known as an analytic philosopher. He performs philosophy according to a particular style of reasoning that's called analytic philosophy. And he tries to align his philosophical work actually with the hard sciences, the way that hard sciences are executed with experimental studies and control groups and predicting and hypotheses and very laboratory type settings. His book, Richard Rorty, was Consequences of Pragmatism, which itself is turning that term on itself, right? Because pragmatism is all about consequences. So here he's saying consequences of pragmatism. And he was critiquing in particular a kind of philosophy that's called metaphysical philosophy. I mean, this is really getting heavy metaphysical philosophy. It's almost like you need to be staring at the ocean or the sky to really sort through it in your mind. You really got to like reach up there, out here, or somewhere, because it's metaphysical philosophy is like above the other kind of philosophy. Metaphysical philosophy is like philosophy about philosophy. If I can just leave it at that, it's philosophy about philosophy. And his particular term that we use in media criticism is ironism. Ironism, Ironism. It's seeing the world through contingent historical descriptions. Seeing the world through contingent historical descriptions. If something is contingent, it means it depends. That's what contingent means. So seeing the world through historical descriptions that depend on certain factors. And what he tries to do to unearth this kind of thinking is to compare vocabularies of our past with alternative redescriptions. To compare vocabularies of the past with alternative redescriptions. Okay, so one of the words that used to be in circulation in the English language was janitor, and that term came to be associated with for whatever reason, because they were stereotyped in TV in some circumstances, with a person who was down and out or mentally slow or who had a creep factor to them. These are the people working in high schools and in other public buildings, cafeterias and whatnot. So that term went out of favor, and it was replaced with custodian. Custodian has a much more regal feel to it. If you're custodian, you're taking care of something. That thing is in your care. You're responsible for it. You have to be a responsible person to have something in your custody. And it's an example of what we're talking about here with ironism. It's compare. So what are the vocabularies if we look back at television shows from the 70s? We're going to see a lot more sexism. We're going to see a lot more jokes about men and women. And just the way that language is used, we're going to see people saying simple sentences like, I've always told a person if they want to be successful, he has to reach for the stars. The he there, right? It's totally sexist. Totally sexist, genderist in a way. So we would look at vocabularies to use this term ironism when we're trying to pry apart media content according to Richard Rorty. another tough name to say. It's got two R's in it. He also spoke about relativism before we leave him behind here. Relativism is trying to take a diverse approaches to theories when you're trying to understand media because they're all equally correct. And that's actually what we're doing in this class. We're taking a diverse approach to different theories. We've done Marxism, we've done organizational analysis. Those are almost completely opposite in some ways. We're doing a third one now. We're going to be moving into others as well. So now let's move to a broader discussion of the pragmatic approach to government and the regulation of media. So the pragmatic approach to the regulation of government and media, first of all, looks at consequences. And it must say that the consequences looks at whether there are clear effects of a given regulation on society, whether there are clear effects of given regulations. And if those clear effects are there, are they good or are they bad? And that will justify the regulations. So one of the regulations we have in the United States is an obscenity regulation. If you say fuck, if you say shit, if you say piss, cunt, motherfucker, cocksucker, asshole, tits, excuse me for being so graphic, but I have to tell you exactly what the law says. Yeah, it's actually a skit from George Carlin's Dirty Words, the 7 words you can't say on television, filthy words he called them. Even that word got changed to dirty words. Shit, piss, fuck, motherfucker, cocksucker, asshole, and tits. If you say any of those words on television in a broadcast setting, not on cable, not subscription, not pay-per-view, in a broadcast television show, your station is liable to be fined over $300,000. And that's exactly what happened to Janet Jackson's CBS broadcast, or to CBS, I should say, when the so-called wardrobe malfunction happened. So that's a law that we have. What are the clear effects of that? Is that good or that bad? I mean, some would argue that's good because we don't have young people exposed to sexuality at too early of an age because it would XYZ them. Other people say, oh no, we need to have more of the body in natural settings. Not like Janet Jackson where it's just pulled away. That's choreographed. More natural, like on a TV show, two people, making love or whatever, getting in the shower. That's a natural scene. Anyway, that's for you to decide, and that's the beauty of pragmatism. It looks at consequences. Next up is contingencies. Contingencies is using the context and the situation to evaluate the regulations. Using the context and the situation to evaluate the regulations. So there is a regulation in the United States right now. It was passed into law under the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed after 9/11, and the law says that if you make a phone call to somebody in another country, or if they make a phone call to you, then you are both liable to be recorded by the National Security Agency of the United States to a foreign country. Okay, that was a law that was passed right after 9/11 to protect the United States because the people who flew the airplanes were from other countries, Saudi Arabia, I believe. And so this law was in place at that time. Is it still relevant? Do we still need that law there? That's what we're talking about here with contingencies, is the context and the situation. Is the situation, the context today, the same that it was? Do we have better intelligence that we get today so we don't need to have that law in place anymore? That's what contingency analysis would ask in terms of a pragmatic approach to government regulation. In essence, pragmatism rejects constants. You got to be pragmatic. It's always saying keep the outcomes in mind. Like, don't be, if the same thing keeps happening over and over. Let's say like you're a parent and you're saying to your kids, and I've been through this myself. Okay, you have to clean your room. You have to clean your room. You have to clean your room. If you're not going to clean your room, you're going to get this taken away. If you're not going to clean your room, you're going to get this taken away. If you're not going to, same thing. Room still doesn't get clean. You have to say, the outcome is not changing. You have to change what you are doing. And that's what pragmatism in essence says. It says, in essence, to have regular contingencies, to have things that kind of force you to look at new outcomes all the time. And within that kind of mindset, you will have a tension between free speech and public interest that goes on in your mind. Between free speech and public interest. To what extent do we need to know that a celebrity, for example, has a drug addiction? To what extent do we need to know that? Well, maybe we do if they have been acting erratically in the media, or maybe not. Or maybe we do if they're the subject of an investigation for a domestic dispute. I would think then it might be relevant. So it depends, right? It depends on the contingency, and that's that tension that goes on between when do we want free speech and when do we want public interest, which and sometimes means protecting your privacy to what is known, what gets known in the media. And so, at the government level, when it comes to regulation, there's this constant interplay between government regulation and media self regulation. We like to think in this country, because we have a social responsibility philosophy. You should be familiar with that term from somewhere. I teach it in my comparative media class. But in our country, we do have the viewpoint, the general viewpoint, that the media should be regulating itself. It should be policing itself. And the government is only there like a referee to jump in when the rules are broken, like when one company is colluding with another company to set advertising pricing too high. And that's what is, and airlines are being accused of that right now. United Airlines, I think it's United Airlines and JetBlue. I might not have the United right, but it's JetBlue and another airline being accused of doing unfair pricing practices. And the same thing happens in media, and that's why mergers between companies are looked at by the Justice Department. AT&T to buy Time Warner, it took like 2 years of review by the Justice Department before AT&T was able to do that. So there's an interplay between when the government should act on the public interest best behalf, so that prices are not too high, monopolized, in other words, versus the government getting too involved and over-regulating and telling media what to do when media can regulate themselves the best. So overall, let's go to the big issues in the regulation of American media. We've got one that I just mentioned there. It's monopolies, combating monopolies. It's really tough. Sometimes we need industry leaders. We need like 4 or 5 companies to really be driving what's going on. But then other times we need more competition. Right? Airlines, that's a great example right there, buying an airline ticket. If it's just one airline flying a route from here to Fort Lauderdale or wherever you want to go, there's going to be a high price until another airline comes in and forces that price down through competition. And actually, there's a midway point too. There's an oligopoly. That's when just a few companies are owning the situation. Like there's just a few streaming companies, and even 2 of those are new entrants into that arena. It was just basically Amazon Prime and Netflix. And that was it. And then Disney got into the game, and then Discovery and AT&T now. So it's still an oligopoly, though. It's only 5 choices there. So that's one overall issue. Another one is protecting intellectual property. If you become famous or rich, even if you become a person who's a follower on Instagram and you make a lot of money, if you have a band and you get a lot of downloads of your songs, if you're an artist and people are buying your work, any of that, to what extent are you vulnerable because you're in the digital age and people can just copy it and give it away? And so that's what copyright laws are for, designed to protect you. That's another overall issue at the radio station, which I advise, WESS Radio here at East Stroudsburg University. We have 3 licensing associations that we belong to. We pay subscriptions to them: BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC. Those are all acronyms. If you really want to know them, I'll tell you them in person. But we have to pay to play music on the radio station. And we pay the money to those music licensing companies, and then they pay the artists. Another big issue is maintaining national interest. A lot of times, media can undermine a government, or another way to look at it is they can serve as a watchdog on the government. Either way, media are related to whether a government will stand or fall in some cases. We haven't really known that in this country since we've had pretty much the same government for 200 plus years, but other countries have falls in government, like Ecuador. I was visiting there this summer. They've had a fall in government before, other countries as well. So maintaining national interest and making sure that media are not drumming up dissent within your population or getting 2 sides to fight each other like we had in the Civil War, that's also an issue that comes down to the issue of maintaining national interest. And we saw that in the coverage of presidential elections and the allegations about Russians hacking into our voting system and Chinese allegedly doing the same thing and creating these bots online that get into our social media and start to create doubt about institutions in our country, about Washington, D.C., about police, about white people, about black people, and create doubt. That's what a lot of the allegations are. That's around this interest, maintaining national interests. And then there's another issue, and that's related to this, and that's promoting diversity. Promoting diversity, making sure that television shows, for example, were not, as they used to be, so incredibly, I just have to say, racist. The depiction, in particular, of African Americans, black people on American television, portrayed very often in very working class labor roles, portrayed in roles that were not necessarily flattering to them, although African Americans have to speak for themselves about that. But certainly there have been changes in the way that African Americans are portrayed. And one of the breakthrough television shows I remember well was the Cosby Show, the comedy show, because it finally had a black person in the role of a medical doctor. Wow, his wife. It was his wife. A black woman played that role. That was a breakthrough because of this kind of issue of diversity. The same thing for Latinas, and the representation of them in the media, not just in terms of how people are represented, but how often they are represented as well. So if you have like 15% of your population, should you not have 15% of people who are in that population? Should you not also have that same percentage represented on TV shows, in films, and also the people who are working, the script writers and the producers and the financiers and the production assistants? Everybody should have. So actually the government has some laws that try to correct imbalances. They have the EEO report that all broadcasters have to send, and the Equal Opportunity report. And that's showing that you have X amount of diversity amongst your organization in terms of your hires. Now let's go to the issue of managing morality. Oh boy, that's a tough one. Morality is all relative, right? A moral is relative. Actually, it's individual. It's up to your own belief system. And, there are really big issues like violence and nudity and religion. I will just say those three off the top of my head that are looked at completely oppositely in terms of government regulation depending on where you live in the world. If you take my class Comparative Media, which I'm going to try and teach in Lund, Sweden next summer. Yeah, Comparative Media CMST 410. I've taught it there twice before in Lund, Sweden, right across from the beautiful city of Copenhagen. We talk about stuff like this. Obscenity, in particular, is something that is looked so differently by Europeans, and almost every television show that's a drama at night, you'll see nudity. In France, England, Germany, Italy, it doesn't matter where you are. You'll see a topless woman. You'll see a bottomless man. That's no problem. In France, you'll see two people get into bed with each other, and it doesn't show quote-unquote close-up penetration. That actually is a word that's in the codification of broadcast law in France. Yeah, I know that because I interviewed a person who was on the regulator there, the counterpart to the FCC, for my book, Comparing Media Around the World, and she told me that. Cannot show penetration. Yeah, it's actually in the codification of the regulation. So you have that whole issue of managing morality. Same with violence. Like in the U.S., we show violence in fiction, in dramas. Like CSI, it's a fiction. We'll show violence. But we won't show violence on the TV news. If somebody's killed and the body's laying in the street and there's blood there, we don't show that. They do in Mexico. We don't do that because it interrupts the dinner table. It's unsavory because it's unfair to the family who doesn't know about it yet. Those are the arguments that are made, but it's still a morality question. I always say, what happens if a boy drowns in the Delaware River and the media get there and they decide not to show the body of the boy? What happens? What's the outcome? To ask from a pragmatic standpoint, what's the outcome of not showing that on television? Versus, what happens if you did show a drowned boy, a 13-year-old boy? It happens every summer here. I've lived here for 30 years. Every summer there are 2-3 deaths, sometimes more, from people swimming across the Delaware River. Why not show a boy, if the family, maybe even get the family's permission, so that you can see the real horror of drowning, so you can see the reality, the true outcome of trying to swim across that Delaware after you've been drinking, or as a dare to somebody else, or thinking that it looks really calm. It's not in a lot of places. So it's a managing morality question when it comes to violence. And religion's the same thing. Televangelists, and religion actually is regulated across the world. If you're in Lebanon, but there are very strict things about what you can do if you're a Christian TV station versus if you're a Muslim TV station to keep the peace. Yeah. That's what goes on in Lebanon in terms of their regulation. And lastly, we come to is a big issue, the issue of accuracy. Accuracy, that's ensuring accuracy in the media. And that's really tough for news organizations because they're often up against a clock, right? They're trying to get to a deadline, like 7 o'clock. I was listening to the radio yesterday. I was driving on Route 80, and I was listening to CNN. Yeah, the CNN radio, the car that I had was a loaner car, and it had Sirius radio, and I was listening to CNN, and I was listening to The Situation Room. And they were trying to cover the infrastructure talks that were going on between President Joe Biden, and a bunch of other people who were elected representatives, a bunch of senators, a bunch of House of Representatives, policy people on infrastructure. And you could tell they were waiting. They were hoping that there would be an announcement while they were live during the show. That's what broadcasting is like, especially radio broadcasting and TV broadcasting that's in the area of news. It's looking for live stuff, late breaking stuff. But that also means that you can commit errors, that you can accidentally slander somebody if you get their name wrong. Like John Smythe. Oh, it should have been Smith. Well, I've just said that John Smythe was in a car accident, was arrested for a DUI or whatever. That could be slander. And that's why many organizations, particularly news media organizations, have a code of ethics. They have a code of ethics that you cannot, for example, accept a gift for more than $25 from anybody if you're a news reporter, because you may be biased. You may have to report on them at some time. But $25 is enough for a small little memento. If somebody's grateful that you uncovered corruption at City Hall and got their house back for them, $25. Okay, so but that's what those kinds of rules are about, to ensure accuracy in the way that people report, ensure accuracy in the way that media operate. So I will just finish now with some thoughts about violence. I do think it's an important enough subject to highlight on its own. And there is, according to some media critics, an aggressor effect. You have to decide this for yourself. And that means that certain violent programming, and I'm talking about video games here too, triggers an arousal that would not be there if they weren't watching video games. So I know that there have been studies about a lot of these school shootings, these mass murderers, what they did with their spare time, and there have been studies to try and link it to video gaming. I don't have an opinion about that, but the thinking is that video gaming and watching a lot of movies, or there's a lot of killing, and just in general watching American television, because there's a lot of violence on it, even though it's fiction, is triggering a heightened ability to resort to violence, and is also triggering a less of a sensitivity to other people being hurt by violence. So we don't feel as bad for people as we should because of all the violent stuff we're watching, and we're more prone to be violent, get into road rage, scream at neighbors, than if we weren't looking at media. You can decide that for yourself. Also in the area of violence, we talk about a victim effect. A victim effect is where people experienced a heightened sense that they have been wronged, by the violence, or they have been wronged in committing the violence, as in the case of somebody who is asserting that they had a right to because they were being abused. And what do you do with that if it's in a news story? So there's that dimension of violence as well. And then there's also a bystander effect. And a bystander effect is this indifference that I talked about earlier. It's often talked about in the context of New York City, unfortunately. If somebody is writhing in pain on the sidewalk in New York City, people say nobody's going to stop for you. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's speaking about the bystander effect. Is we see other people struggling, homeless people, barely making it up the sidewalk to get in the grocery store because of their health, and not affected by it. That's also an effect of violence, some media critics say. And then there's the catharsis effect. The catharsis effect is that it's actually saying that violence does the opposite of all these things. It's actually a good thing because it is reducing feelings of aggression. It's reducing feelings of aggression. And the same argument is made sometimes for pornography, saying, no, pornography is not responsible for rape, and neither is watching films that have a lot of gun shooting in them responsible for a person killing another or hurting another person or using a gun in an unlawful way. That actually, pornography gets people to release that sexual tension, and they go on to do other things. That actually, violence gets people, all that gaming that people do, it blowing people up and becoming brand new after you've just been shot to death yourself, and using really high-powered weaponry with incredible sound effects. That's just getting it out of your system. That's what the catharsis effect says. All of which leads to the question of whether there should be a rating system. There's a rating system for video gaming. There's a rating system for television. There's a rating system for film. PG and R. All those ratings, do they really work? I mean, I know when I was a kid and they didn't even have some of the ratings that they have now for film. If there's a film with an R rating, that's the film we wanted to see. We were going to get into that no matter what, because we wanted to see the R film. And actually, pornographers make fun of the film rating system because the Motion Picture Association, which is who comes up with the ratings for films, they did not patent triple X when they patented all the other ones that are the rated R and PG-13, etc. And so the adult film industry said, "Oh, we're going to joke about it and make ours triple X." That's where that comes from. So in a way, that points out, is the rating system useful at all? That's for you to decide. It's subjected to a pragmatic analysis. What are the effects of the regulations that we have in our country, the media regulations that are enforced by the government? What are the effects on the people? That's pragmatism right there. Have a great day.